That's my TikTok intro, but I'm bringing it here. So welcome to the club, YouTube. All right, the Cold War was not fought with bullets. It was fought with ideas, ideologies, and bold strategies. These policies are what's going to shape the world for nearly half a century. And in order to understand the Cold War, it's not just about memorizing dates, it's understanding how these individual leaders' policies, how these doctrines really shape the interconnectivity between the two superpowers for this time. So in this video right here, we're going to go through every major policy or doctrine of the Cold War. We're going to keep it short, sweet, to the point so that you understand it well enough to write on your exam, but then appreciate it later on in life as you continue, hopefully, to study history. I don't know what that was, but let's get into it. All right, so here we are. Major policies and doctrines. All right, I'm going to try to keep this short, sweet, and to the point. First up, the Truman Doctrine. We've covered the Truman Doctrine at several different occasions on this channel right here. So if you need more review, check out some old videos in this revision series, and it should help you firm up your understanding on what is, in my opinion, the most important of all of these policies and doctrines, right? When 1947, why the Yalta spirit is breaking, right? Stalin is encroaching on Eastern Europe. The fear of the growth of the communist world is glooming over the United States. What? It's the declaration of war, right? The United States is going to stop the spread of communism. The word to associate with the Truman Doctrine is going to be the policy of containment, which we'll recap again in just 1 second. All right, again, short, sweet, to the point. That's the Truman Doctrine. I left you guys some quotes on the side about each of these doctrines or policies. If you want to pause to read, go ahead and pause to read. Same thing with the cartoons. I'm going to attach some sort of cartoon or image with each. Take a second to really make sure you understand. If you can figure out how this image appeals to the Truman Doctrine, you should be in pretty good shape. Next up, we've got the Marshall Plan. The when is 1948. The why is same idea as the Truman Doctrine, right? That this communist fear is spreading all throughout Europe at the time. The United States is going to make a very, very, very keen finding. They are going to say that poor countries are more susceptible to turning communism. So the solution here, the way that we can back up our containment policy is by making sure the countries are not poor. All right, so the what is the United States is going to send $14 billion. I think it's like $13.6 billion in aid to Europe to help rebuild after the Second World War, to make that barrier, to make those countries less likely to become impoverished. Winston Churchill says the quote, "Europe is a rubble heap, a breeding ground for hate." General Marshall is going to go to Europe, and he is going to confirm that statement by Churchill, and that is going to hit the go button for the American cash going into Europe, and that is the Marshall Plan or the European Recovery Act. If you get it, if it's written like that, they are one and the same. Again, pause to analyze it real quick if you want. Containment policy, we've talked about this. I put a quote by Eisenhower here about the domino theory, right? Domino theory doesn't necessarily apply to the entire Cold War. That's really coined during the Vietnam War. But containment is if you can understand domino theory, you understand containment. One domino falls, all the rest will fall. One country turns communist, the neighboring countries might turn communist. So this is that idea of we need to contain communism where it is, right? It is in Eastern Europe, and of course, Russia proper, we need to keep it there, all right? The first challenges to containment are going to be over in Asia with the People's Republic of China, and then North Korea invading South Korea in 1950, all right? This is going to be followed up or debuted in George Kennan's Long Telegram. Again, we've got videos about it earlier on in the channel if you want to go back and check those out. I even included this one picture on the last video that I did. All right, NATO. So here's a big one, right? This is something that I haven't covered very exclusively here. The when is 1949. The why is the Berlin blockade / Berlin airlift / First Berlin crisis, which I did do a video on a couple weeks ago. All right. This is the formal defensive military alliance for Western Europe. They got so afraid during Berlin that that war would become more likely, that war is closer, the Third World War is right around the corner, that they wanted to shore up some of those smaller countries in Central and Western Europe. So they take the Brussels Treaty Organization, they include the United States and Canada, and that is essentially the birth of NATO. All right. Here we just have a picture of one of the first NATO meetings. The Warsaw Pact, reciprocal, right? They are one and the same, right? NATO needed its defensive military alliance against the Soviet. The Soviet needed its defensive military alliance against Western Europe, right? If Western Europe is going to encroach on Eastern European land and take some of those bordering countries, Poland in particular, then they need an ability to come together, band together, and defend themselves. So that is what Warsaw is, right? Warsaw is going to solidify, formalize that Iron Curtain that has descended across the continent. This is going to be in 1959 while Nikita Khrushchev is in power. And here we have that dividing line through Europe. The secret speech, this is a big one. I've showed this no love on this channel right here, but it's a really important part of the Cold War, right? So this is going to be 1956, 2 years after the death of Stalin. Nikita Khrushchev is going to go in front of the 20th Party Congress, and he is going to essentially throw Stalin under the bus a little bit, right? That's what the secret speech is all about. The word association game I like to teach my students: secret speech, de-Stalinization, right? I have hand gestures that I use. Stalin is that iron fist. Khrushchev is going to let up that iron fist a little bit. In this speech, he is going to talk badly about the cult of personality that's formed around Stalin. He talks badly about the implementation of common form and how rigid that socialism became under Stalin and all of those things. That's going to lead Eastern Europe to believe that they now have the ability to dissent. And that's the big significance here, right? The secret speech is going to lead to immediate dissent issues inside of Eastern Europe, in Poland and Hungary in 1956, right? At this point in the Cold War, the standard of living is so low in some of these satellite states that as soon as they hear that it might be okay to dissent against the Kremlin, that's exactly what they're going to do. So Nikita Khrushchev's secret speech is going to lead Eastern Europe to think is the key word there, think that they can revolt or dissent against the Soviet, when in reality that wasn't true, all right? There is a picture of de-Stalinization at its finest, right? That's the Hungarian Revolution, and they are taking down the statue of Stalin. Shout out to my former Hungarian students who really appreciate this picture. The Eisenhower Doctrine is next, right? Here, the United States kind of realizes that it messed up a little bit, right? When Truman issues the policy of containment, it is predominantly about Europe, right? Martial aid goes to Europe, right? That's the lens. That's how I teach it, right? This is the lens that the early Cold War is fought, right? And everyone is kind of locked in on Eastern Europe, making sure that Eastern, Middle Europe, whatever, Europe in general just doesn't, the communism doesn't extend or capitalism doesn't extend over here, and they're really locked into it. And then 1949 happens and everyone goes, oops, or at least the West goes, whoops, because the People's Republic of China forms, and then they realize, like, oh, this might be a global thing. We thought this was going to be a Europe thing, but now this might be a global thing, because the People's Republic of China comes around, and then in the subsequent year, the Korean War breaks out, right? So now this idea of containment, this idea of the Truman Doctrine is going to spread all over the place. The Eisenhower Doctrine is a continuation of the Truman Doctrine, right? Eisenhower doesn't want to change the policy of containment. There's actually talks in the Eisenhower administration of rolling back, like taking communism out of some of the places that it expanded to, but we won't get into that here. The Eisenhower Doctrine is after the Suez Crisis, where we see how vulnerable the Middle East is and how vulnerable some of our oil is. So in 1957, Eisenhower is going to explicitly state that the Middle East is now under the radar, or on the radar of the United States, and they too are going to get folded into this policy of containment and dragged into the Cold War politics of the time, right? So the Eisenhower Doctrine, even though it's in 57, the real ripple effects of the Eisenhower Doctrine are going to come in the late 1970s, early 1980s, when the Middle East erupts into their crises. I love this picture for the Eisenhower Doctrine. There's a new sheriff in town, and you see Uncle Sam coming in. Rapprochement, here's a big one. Rapprochement, you got to think of the triangle, right? Rapprochement is going to be Nixon and Kissinger's policy. Again, think of a triangle. The top leg of the triangle is going to be the United States. The bottom leg of one side of the triangle, I'm not a mathematician, so I'm not going to use the right words here. I'm sorry to my wife, who is a math teacher. Hopefully she doesn't see this and give me a lesson on triangle vocabulary that I will certainly fall asleep to. See how uncomfortable I got in math? Just, ugh. All right, so again, top part of the triangle, the United States. Bottom part of a triangle, the Soviet Union. The other bottom part of the triangle is China, right? This is all going to open up when Nixon visits China for the first time in 1971, right? So Kissinger and Nixon are going to bridge their relationship between China and the United States closer. The closer that those two get, the farther away the Soviet Union feels like it is, because this is during the time period of the Sino-Soviet split. So the Chinese and the Russians do not have a solid relationship. So the Americans want to take advantage of that conflict and draw closer to China. This is forcing the Soviet Union out of leverage at the negotiation table. One of the big examples that we see rapprochement kind of come into play is the end of the Vietnam War, right? Nixon wanted to use this triangle diplomacy. That's another way to call it, triangle diplomacy. He wanted to use it to get a favorable end to the Vietnam War, which in 1973 he kind of did, right? So rapprochement was a pretty solid way about Cold War politics during that détente time period. It's not until after Watergate that all of that stuff in Vietnam kind of unravels. So again, that's a story for another video. Maybe some point next year I do that, but that's rapprochement. Another thing that rapprochement is going to lead to is the SALT I talks and this idea of that détente time period, right? We're going to use that triangle diplomacy to get better situations at some of these talks that we want. SALT, I haven't covered that exclusively yet, but one thing I like to say, and I'll bring it up now, the main idea in SALT is the L. It's all about limitation. It's not about reduction. That's going to be another treaty later on, right? We have this many nukes. We're going to keep this many nukes. We're just going to make it so that we can't add on a lot more every year, and that's going to turn down that dial that's known as détente, turn down that tension dial. Ping pong, right? That's what opens up this whole thing. The ping pong diplomacy is what is going to open up that door between the United States and China, and that's going to pave the way for Kissinger to visit secretly, and then Nixon to visit later on in 1971. And again, triangle diplomacy, think of the three legs of the triangle and how the United States is going to take advantage of the Soviet Union by reaching out closer to China. Hopefully my triangle talk made any kind of sense. Again, sorry, Grace, if I offended you. All right, let's move on. The Brezhnev Doctrine, okay? This changes the game completely, right? So the Warsaw Pact, we covered it a little while ago. That's going to be that defensive military alliance for Eastern Europe, for the Eastern Bloc, right? Now, when you think a defensive military alliance, you think it's there, it exists to prevent external acts of aggression, external threats. Brezhnev goes, wait a minute. The Warsaw Pact is not only about external threats, it applies to internal threats as well. So the when is 1968 and the why is the Prague Spring, right? There is such internal upheaval in the late 1960s because, again, low standards of living at this time, that Brezhnev is going to say that it's all of our jobs, all of the Warsaw countries' jobs to go in and protect Czechoslovakia from itself, right? So that is an internal threat, and that is going to be the Brezhnev Doctrine. The Brezhnev Doctrine is going to slam that fist shut again. So again, my guys, hopefully you remember this. Stalin, Khrushchev, Brezhnev. He closes that fist again real quick with the Brezhnev Doctrine and takes that Eastern European descent and essentially slams the door for the next, 20 years? Almost 20 years until Eastern European descent is revitalized. So Prague Spring is the reason for the Brezhnev Doctrine, and here we see Soviet tanks rolling through the streets of Prague in the late 1960s. Détente, I've mentioned it before, turn down that dial, right? The reason that détente comes into existence is the Cuban Missile Crisis. We came this close to nuclear apocalypse in Cuba. The leaders realized that the next conflict will be a nuclear one, right? That we were so dangerously close, and our diplomacy was so slow and so precautionary and so centered around mistrust that the next conflict will lead to a nuclear apocalypse, and we don't want that happening, right? So they lead to the time period of détente, which is an easing of tensions, all right? The two main treaties to talk about during détente are SALT I and SALT II. SALT I, L is the most important letter, that limitation. SALT II, look to build on that limitation. It's not until the invasion of Afghanistan and the Iranian Revolution that SALT II kind of falls apart in front of the U.S. Congress, and they never sign it. So again, if you need a little review there, there's a teeny tiny review on SALT I and SALT II. Don't get salty if I didn't do a good enough job there. Get it? Salt joke. I'm done with that. I apologize. So yeah, let's go to the next slide. There's détente, right? The salt shakers playing chess with all of the nuclear armaments, realizing that we need to limit this or else it's going to be the end of all of us. The Reagan Doctrine. All right, so now, the hero, Ronald Reagan, comes into play in the late 1980s, and he's saying that containment's not a thing anymore. We're not going to contain communism. We are going to defeat communism, right? This is going to ratchet up a lot of conflicts in the late 1980s, specifically in Afghanistan and Nicaragua, which is, again, is a story for another video. But one of the main tools that Reagan is going to fight or battle the Reagan Doctrine through is through the Strategic Defense Initiative. So Ronald Reagan comes up with the idea that he is going to, or the United States is going to create space lasers as a nuclear deterrent, and that if a nuclear bomb was shot at the United States, it would be able to shoot it out of the sky. Didn't exist. It wasn't real. But Star Wars is going to be a major part of the end of the Cold War and the unraveling of the Soviet Union economically. So the Reagan Doctrine is really going to be fought through that big bluff that he told about the Strategic Defense Initiative and how MAD would essentially go away because the United States could not be attacked with a nuclear bomb. Here we have Reagan, spreading joy to the world, making sure that communism ceases to exist, and the sleigh that he's riding in on is the Star Wars program. So, maybe down the line I'll make a video specifically on Reagan, the Reagan Doctrine, and Star Wars. For now, that was a brief little summary for you. And while all of this is going on, we've got Gorbachev doing his part at the end of the Cold War with the issuing of Glasnost and Perestroika. I apologize for my terrible Russian accent, but you get what you get, you know what I mean? So Glasnost is going to be this idea of openness, right? This is what we call Pandora's box. Once he utters these words, it's the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union and the communist bloc. He essentially is going to wink, wink, nod, nod, tell the Eastern European countries that they can now voice their dissent. So this is very similar to the secret speech, except the intention was Soviet dissent, right? The intention of the secret speech was not Soviet dissent. That's why they slammed the door on it in the late 50s in Hungary. This was Soviet dissent. So one more time, back to my hand gestures. Stalin, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, Gorbachev. Stalin, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, Gorbachev. Stalin, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, Gorbachev, right? If you remember those four, you're fine, right? The Soviet economy is going to be incredibly stagnant, right? This is like after Chernobyl, and they realize how broken their economies are and how broken just the whole chain of command is. Chernobyl is a really interesting thing to study and how it relates to the collapse of the Soviet Union. The economies were so stagnant, the standards of living were so low that he gives them the nod to say you can now dissent against us, but also he's going to incorporate some capitalist ideas into the parts of the economy where the state-sponsored system or the state-run system is not working anymore. So Glasnost, Perestroika, the beginning of the end, the country that hears Glasnost first and loudest and most clearly is going to be Poland, and they are going to erupt into their kind of civil dissent with the solidarity movement of the 1980s. All right, here we have Gorbachev, and again, once he utters Glasnost, the genie is out of the bottle, right? It's the opening of Pandora's box. He cannot undo that. And then the last but final doctrine of the Cold War is, or at least this video, is going to be the Sinatra Doctrine, right? So this is going to be in 1989, and this is going to be as an homage to that very famous and my favorite Frank Sinatra song, My Way, right? I did it my way. So Gorbachev is going to tell these Eastern European states that they can approach socialism in their own way, and that is going to lead to essentially the dismantling of the Soviet Union. If you notice, 1989 is a really big year. That's the fall of the Berlin Wall, and right after Berlin falls, you have all of the other, you've got the Velvet Revolution, you got all of these other revolutions that take place in Eastern Europe, which essentially leads to the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. And what better picture to end it with than my boy Frankie Blue Eyes. If you're an Italian American, you grew up with this guy and you grew up with that song, especially as a Yankee fan. So that's what I'm going to end this video. This video is probably going to be the last video I upload before this exam session. I feel like I reached a lot of you over the past 2 or 3 weeks that I started really making videos again. You guys have been awesome. Thank you for watching along. I'll definitely keep making videos into next year, but these revision videos are really special to me. I really like reaching out to you guys. I really like some of the comments and how you're voicing that I helped, and that's my main goal here. So for the last time before the exams, good luck. Be good. Thanks for watching.